In this lecture, I want to take a look at some of the ways that human reasoning goes wrong. I've chosen 3 very common reasoning errors. Errors that crop up both in daily life and in science. Errors that I think any good scientist, or indeed anyone, should be aware of. You see them very often and you're going to be tempted to make them yourself. By taking a good look at them now, we can hopefully avoid making these errors ourselves in the future. The 3 errors that I want to discuss are the following. First, we'll talk about confirmation bias. Second, we're going to look at the confusion of correlation with causation. And finally, we'll talk about some of the mistakes that people make when reasoning about probabilities. So let's start with confirmation bias. This is an error of reasoning that we are probably all guilty of on an almost daily basis. Confirmation bias means that we are biased towards confirmation. That is, that we have a tendency to collect and take seriously evidence that supports our beliefs, and a tendency to disregard or ignore evidence that conflicts with our beliefs. In this way, we are continually strengthening what we already believe while ignoring things that could make us change our mind. For example, suppose that you have a housemate whom you consider to be a very selfish person. One day he forgets to buy toilet paper and you say to yourself, "What a selfish guy, he never does anything for the common good." A couple of days later, he makes a cake to share with all of his housemates. And you say to yourself, "What a selfish guy, he's just doing that to become popular." That is confirmation bias. Whatever this person does, you always interpret it in such a way that it fits your opinion or prejudice about him. Nothing would change your mind. Now, scientists are certainly not immune to confirmation bias. A scholar who firmly believes that Charles Dickens was a political revolutionary will probably find a lot of very revolutionary passages in his books. On the other hand, a scholar who believes that Charles Dickens was a compassionate conservative will probably find a lot of very conservative passages. Both will tend to either miss or dismiss the passages that the other one finds, and both will end up being even more convinced of their own view than they were before. Of course, such confirmation bias will diminish the quality of their literary interpretations. Good scholars try to overcome confirmation bias. One way to do that is to very consciously try to keep an open mind and to try to be attentive to evidence that might undercut your current point of view. Science as a whole tries to combat confirmation bias by fostering a lot of different opinions, and by having scholars assess each other's opinions in free and open debate. Science may not always be successful in getting rid of bias, but at least we are trying. The second type of reasoning error that I want to look at is the confusion of correlation with causation. We speak of correlation when 2 types of events tend to happen together. There is, for example, a correlation between smoking and lung cancer, because lung cancer develops more often in people who smoke than in people who don't smoke. Another correlation would be that between learning really hard for an exam and getting a good grade. If you learn really hard, you increase the probability of getting a good grade. Now, in both of these examples, we don't just have a correlation, but also causation. Smoking isn't just correlated with lung cancer, it causes lung cancer. Learning really hard causes you to get a good grade. Because correlation and causation are so often connected, it's very tempting to believe that correlation implies causation. That whenever you find a correlation, there must also be causation. So, suppose that you find that in the 1930s, fascism was strongest in those European countries where unemployment was highest. That's a correlation, and you might be tempted to conclude that being unemployed causes people to adopt fascism. But that would be an error, because correlation does not imply causation. For instance, there is a correlation between getting lung cancer and listening to the music of André Hazes. But it's not the case that listening to André Hazes causes lung cancer, or that having lung cancer causes you to listen to his music. What's actually the case is that André Hazes is more popular with less educated people than with highly educated people. And that smoking is also more popular with less educated people than with highly educated people. So people who listen to Hazes have a slightly higher probability of smoking. And this in turn means that people who listen to Hazes have a slightly higher probability of getting lung cancer. There is a correlation, but there is no cause and effect. In the same way, the historian cannot simply conclude that unemployment causes fascism, because perhaps there is something else that causes both unemployment and fascism. Or maybe it's just an accident that the two are correlated. People are very quick to believe that they have found a relation of cause and effect. But a good scientist should know that it is very hard to prove causation. And this is especially true in disciplines like history, where you can't do experiments. We can't take 100 countries and turn up the unemployment in 50 of them to see what happens to fascism. So we need to be very, very careful whenever we make causal claims. Thirdly, we also need to be very careful when we use probabilities, because people are well known for making many mistakes with them. Let's take an example I saw in the news a couple of years ago. There had been a train accident and there were two possible explanations. Either the sign had malfunctioned and had been green when it should have been red, or the train driver made a mistake and had driven through a red sign. On the news there was a guy from a company who operated the signs, and that guy said, well, the chance that a sign malfunctions is only 1 in a million, so it must have been the driver who made the mistake. That is a completely wrong argument. Why? Because we cannot compare the two hypotheses if we only know the probabilities of one of them. It could be that the chance that a train driver makes a mistake is also just 1 in a million. In fact, I hope so, because if it is a lot bigger than that, we will have a lot of train accidents. But if both the driver and the sign go wrong in only 1 of a million cases, then given that in this particular case either of the two went wrong, it's actually a 50-50 chance which it was. An even more famous example of this mistake, at least in the Netherlands, was that of the nurse Lucia de Berg, who was convicted of 7 counts of murdering her patients in the hospital. There was no direct evidence that she poisoned anyone. It just happened to be the case that Lucia de Berg was at work caring for these patients when each of them died. The prosecutors then calculated that the probability that any nurse would have the bad luck of so many patients suddenly dying from natural causes was extremely small, only 1 in a million, and that therefore it was extremely likely that she had killed them. But this is again the same mistake. We also need to know what the probability is that a nurse intentionally kills 7 patients. And that is presumably also very, very small. Because contrary to what horror films might make you believe, most nurses are not serial killers. It was only after intensive lobbying by scientists that there was a retrial and that Lucia de Berg was acquitted. Here, what we should learn as scientists is that the fact that a hypothesis is unlikely doesn't mean that it's false. We need to think through whether the alternatives might not be even more unlikely. So, we have looked at 3 types of reasoning error: confirmation bias, confusion correlation with causation, and mistaken use of probabilities. I hope that knowing about them will make you less likely to make these mistakes yourself. If so, science will be in a slightly better place.